Hi, welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour. We're joined today by a very special guest. He's very special first and foremost because he's a very dear friend of mine, but that's just from a personal perspective. Aside from that, Professor Avi Bell, who's joining us today, is one of the leading, not only Israeli jurists about the domestic situation with Israel's legal system, but also international jurists. He has a joint appointment at the Ilan University School of Law and at University of San Diego Law School. He's a fellow at numerous forums, including the Kohelet Forum and the Tikva Fund. And let me just show you him. Here we go. Hey, Avi, welcome to the program.
I have to correct one thing. I don't have a fellowship from the Tikva Fund. I do run some programs in cooperation with Tikva, but I want to be precise.
Yes, because he's a law professor. This is one of the running things that we've been friends for over 20 years, Avi and yes. I, Professor Bell and I, and in fact I knew him before he was a doctor, right? Before he was a doctor. Anyway, but he always needs everything very precise, which is excellent when you're dealing with law, which is what we're going to be talking about here. So the first thing that we want to talk about is the domestic political legal situation with our Attorney General. Avi was one of the attorneys who represented Prime Minister Netanyahu at the pre-indictment hearing that Attorney General Mandelblit held for him. And we want to talk about specifically one thing that Mandelblit said 2 weeks ago. But before we do that, what was that? What was that hearing like? What was it about? And what did it tell you sort of generally about the legal system's handling of Netanyahu and the indictments against him?
So, well, I'm going to nitpick again.
What's that?
I was not there formally. I was not there formally as a representative of the Prime Minister. I was there as sort of as an amicus, that is an outsider who was bringing an expert opinion. It's true that the reason I was there was the rest of the legal team of the Prime Minister had asked me to come, but the one who invited me was Mandelblit. He was the only one who had the authority to do so. Now I can tell you what it was like. It was a full room.
Wait, what is this idea of a pre-indictment hearing? I don't think that's necessarily a familiar concept.
Okay, the way it's supposed to work in Israel is this: if charges are being brought against a public official, before the charge sheet can actually be filed in a court, the Attorney General has to arrange for there to be a hearing in which there will be a fresh new question about whether it's a good idea, whether it's in the public interest to file criminal charges. Now, in this case, it was a little bit ridiculous because half a year before this hearing, the Attorney General Mandelblit had held a primetime press conference to announce that he was intending to bring criminal charges against the Prime Minister, against Netanyahu. And the chances that he would turn around and say, you know what, I've been convinced that the entire legal theory on which I've based this prosecution is faulty. There was never any such chance. And when I got to the hearing, it was, as I said, it was a full room. There were 30 or more lawyers from the Attorney General and the Justice Ministry and the State Attorney's Office, and almost all of them were silent during the entirety of it. 2 or 3 of them cracked cynical remarks as it went on, but what I was told in advance was that it was pointless, that there was nobody who was going to be listening to the legal argument that I was making, and that turned out to be the case.
And what was the legal argument that you were making?
I said there's no such thing as a crime of giving a bribe of positive media coverage, and inventing such a crime, as Mandelblit has done for purposes of the case against the Prime Minister, is devastating to freedom of speech in this country. And it also creates a risk of politicization of criminal prosecutions. And I think that we're seeing both effects now. That is, there's a real threat to freedom of speech. You see journalists being dragged into court to explain why they would run this story or that story. And you can see in every minute that the prosecution is charging people based on politics rather than strictly legal considerations.
You know, I mean, there were so many appalling aspects to this appeal, which was a quasi-judicial body, right? I mean, he's deciding whether or not he's going to indict the prime minister, and there may be just a political body in the sense that
it's legally required. And not only is it legally required, there's a legal standard. And the legal standard is he has to come in with an open heart and a willing spirit. Right now, I don't understand how anybody can claim that they held a primetime press conference during the height of a political campaign to accuse somebody of being a criminal under this brand new crime that was just invented. And yet, at the moment of the hearing, all of a sudden, everything was wiped clean and there was a willing spirit.
Especially when the chief prosecutor, Liat Ben-Ari, skipped the entire hearing and went on a safari in Africa with her family.
She just skipped half of it. She went to some of it.
Oh, she did?
Yeah, she did attend some of it.
Oh, so apologies to Liat Ben-Ari.
Yeah, there's one other bit that's important to know, which is it's one of the legal requirements in order to bring criminal charges against a prime minister in Israel is that the attorney general personally has to approve the investigation. Now, that would mean that before this all began, right, many years before the hearing, the attorney general had to already have been up to his neck in this. Now, I'll add that as it turns out, the attorney general didn't do this properly. That is, he never signed a written authorization, which is against the law in Israel. And traditionally, according to precedents, what that's meant is that the indictment should have been thrown out by the court. In this case, Netanyahu's lawyers made a motion to throw out the indictment because there had never been any written authorization. And the court said, well, Mr. Attorney General, you misbehaved here. You broke the law. That was really terrible. Don't do it again. But we're going to hear this case.
You know, and, I mean, that really raises the question that so many people here ask every single day, how is this even happening? And this really brings us to what I wanted to talk about, what Avichai Mandelblit said a couple of weeks ago, or was reported. He said it, I think, in November at a conference that was held by Haaretz, which is Israel's furthest to the left newspaper, which is saying a lot because.
Wait. No. I think you're mixing up several different comments. Doit Banish, the former Chief Justice.
No, I'm not. No, you're wrong. Wait, no. Wait, don't interrupt me for a second. This is my show. All right, sorry. You guys have to understand, we've been friends for a really long time. This is kind of like you're listening to a private conversation here. Anyway, So no, there were three things. I want to talk about Mandelblit. So Mandelblit had remarks that were leaked. That is released.
Those are private in his office.
No, they were not. That's not. No, one of the reports, the report that I saw was that there was a closed briefing that he held for reporters under the auspices of Haaretz newspaper. Dorit Banish, the former Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, gave a speech at a conference in public that was held by Haaretz. So these are two distinct and separate Haaretz events. Okay, counselor? All right. So now, and then there was a third thing that that former Attorney General and current sitting and outgoing, I understand he's resigning, Supreme Court Justice Meni Mazuz said. Did he say that also in Haaretz? I can't remember anymore.
It was an interview that was published in the Haaretz magazine.
Are we seeing a pattern here? Just to be clear, Haaretz is the furthest to the left newspaper in Israel, which means that it's well over the cliff, right? I mean, it can't even see the cliff from where it's fallen to, in terms of the leftward outermost excesses that you can possibly imagine. That's Haaretz. So all three of them were in Haaretz forums of various types. Now let's start with Avichai Mandelblit's closed briefing to reporters that was reported on Channel 12 News some 2 weeks ago. What was it that he said?
Right. I'll just say I'm not sure that it was and I'll tell you why it's important, and then I'll tell you the content. The way I saw
see what I have to deal with here. You see what
I'm a nitpicker. What can I tell you?
He's precise. He's a good lawyer.
The way I saw the report was that Mandelblit had a private discussion with some people in the Justice Ministry and the Attorney General's office, and that was recorded and leaked. Now, if it wasn't to reporters, if it really was the way I saw it, to insiders in the ministry, it's inconceivable that such a thing happened without Mandelblit orchestrating the entire thing. So I think it's fairly clear that Mandelblit orchestrated this leak. And in this leak, what he said was that he congratulated himself for toppling Netanyahu because he said that he was defending Israeli democracy, that Israeli democracy was in danger from Netanyahu. And as the remarks went on, he made clear what he meant by that. What he meant by that was that Netanyahu had, as he understood it, threatened to appoint people with a different philosophy of judging and prosecuting than that which animates Mandelblit. That is, with a different ideology, right? Instead of being hyper judicial activists, and instead of supporting political prosecutions, and instead of leaning left, these would be people that are more ideologically aligned with what was then the governing party. And to Mandelblit, this would be undermining democracy, because democracy to Mandelblit doesn't mean the will of the people or ruling according to majority desires, that letting the people rule. What it means is making decisions that are in accordance with the ideological preference of this narrow band of left-leaning, hyper-activist, anti-liberal lawyers, the lawyers that man the Attorney General's office and the State Attorney's office and the Supreme Court, that have a set of ideological beliefs. The prime one of which is that as lawyers, there are philosopher kings that are the true judges of what's good and bad for society.
Years ago, I think it was in 2007, very strange set of circumstances, which I won't go into. I was at a very small dinner party with Aaron Barak and his wife, and a couple of other judges. And Aaron Barak was sitting there congratulating himself for approving or ordering, mandating civil unions for gay couples. And I said to him, on the basis of what did you do this? Where's your authority as the Chief Justice to mandate, to require the Ministry of the Interior to form this concept of civil unions for homosexual couples that give them the privileges or the rights of married couples? And he said, well, I'm a judge. And I said, so? I'm a voter. I said, I don't understand. Why do you decide this and not the Knesset? And he looked at me like I had fallen out of the sky, because in his perception of the way things are supposed to be, his position is supposed to determine the mores and the law of Israel, that this is how it's going to be. And this isn't getting into any question about where I stand on anything related to civil unions. It was a question of why something that was never legislated, something that I don't even know if at the time it was even discussed at the Knesset, is something that he should be, he was essentially the first, his courtroom was the first place where this issue was ever determined, the Supreme Court. And this is a major move. This is a major change in Israeli society. And is he the right person to do it or not? From his perspective, there was no question that he was the person who was supposed to do it because he's him. And I said, well, why are your views any more important than then Minister of the Interior from Shas, Eli Yishai? And he looked again like he couldn't understand where the question was coming from, because that's the concept. And of course, Avichai Mandelblit, who said that he saved the Jewish people, no less, he saved the Jewish people by indicting Netanyahu, is not alone in this philosophy. You know, we with all of the flames and the fires are being pointed at him, but he's part of a system. And in fact, it was Barak himself who said, I think in 2015, when the investigations, as you said, which were not authorized lawfully by Mandelblit to begin with against Netanyahu began, he said that Mandelblit knows what he's supposed to do, which leads us then to what Dorit Beinish, who succeeded Barak as the president or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, however you want to refer to them, said at the Haaretz conference. Right.
Yeah. Well, she made comments that are more or less along the lines of Mandelblit's, which she sat down and the interviewer said to her, "Are you last time you were here, you were very worried about the future of Israeli democracy. Now do you feel better about it than Netanyahu's gone?" She said, "Certainly, yeah, I feel a lot better about it, but the danger's not completely over." Right now, this is not. She's not the only one either. You know, Many Mazos in his Haaretz interview this weekend said more or less the same thing. You know, that there's a danger of democracy being crushed in Israel by Netanyahu because Netanyahu doesn't appreciate the role of judges, and he was explaining his role. His role was to carry out his ideological preferences, and the first half of the interview is a discussion of Mazos's policy battle for years to try to prevent the demolition of houses of Palestinian terrorists. And he describes the various reasons that he wanted to find it illegal. One of the six, I think, was the law. The others were, you know, his sense of morality and his ideological preference, and you know, his sense of whether it's good policy. And this seems to them, this seems to Mazos, this seems to Beinish, this seems to Barak, this seems to Mandelblit, all perfectly normal, that the chief policymaker in the country is a lawyer.
Who is not elected. I mean, if a lawyer were elected, it would be okay that he was a lawyer, right? We don't have anything against lawyers. We have something against unelected lawyers.
Right.
Who are acting as though they're elected.
We're replacing the elected policymakers, and they think that the very definition of democracy is for elected officials to be trampled and for their policy decisions to be overridden by lawyers, by unelected lawyer bureaucrats and unelected judges, and the worst part of this is that there's an inevitable result of this when you see this sort of seizure of power by a group of unelected bureaucrats. Over time, it can't help but lead them to use their powers politically, use their powers not simply to impose their policy preferences, but to fight those who are trying to grapple with them over control of policy, which means that they are fighting the elected officials. They're trying to repress and suppress elected officials to make sure that the lawyers keep control of policy, that they're the last word. And that leads to things like criminal charges on made-up crimes against the prime minister, and other ministers, other political officials. You know, just in the last week, Mandelblit has managed to get rid of two other heads of parties in the Knesset. It leads to these strange and crazy policy discussions. You know, the other day there were reports about this long debate in a Knesset committee about certain things that should be done or not be done on COVID policy. Now, as you know, I entirely agree with you that the policy of this government on COVID leaves much to be desired.
Like a policy on COVID, for instance, right? I mean, yeah. The main thing that it leaves to be desired is an actual policy, which it just lacks. It has moods. It has mood swings, right?
What I'm absolutely certain about is that the last word is that of the parliament, the Knesset, and the government which enjoys the parliament's confidence, right? That's the way things work in a parliamentary democracy. But instead, the news that was reported was that Mandelblit will not permit certain measures, and he's decided that he will permit certain other measures.
I want to back up a second from the COVID thing. I want to back up a second because you said something that we just sort of brushed over. All right. So right now we have Netanyahu, and he's on trial on 4 counts and 3 indictments, right? And the main one, the most important one, I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago in Newsweek, and you and I have spoken about this probably for hundreds of hours over the past several years, is this bribery thing that he made up. There is no concept of positive coverage being bribery, and we've seen that in the court case itself.
There's no case like that in the history of the democratic world.
Right, and we see, and the thing that's most vile, I mean, or an additional aspect to this indictment that's vile. It's not just that the crime itself, the alleged crime itself, doesn't exist in the law books, not only of Israel, but of any country, but that there was never any bribe given. And there was never any, there was never any that Netanyahu, who ostensibly received great coverage in exchange for regulatory favors, the prosecution has put its 8-star witnesses on the stand over the past 2.5 months, and all 8 have obliterated the prosecution's case. Oh, the coverage that Netanyahu received from this website was horrific, and he had no role in any regulatory process. So the whole thing, that not only is the charge invented, but the ostensible crime never happened on either side, either on the side of the bribee or the briber. Nobody did anything that they're accused of. It's all a lie. And so he got rid of Netanyahu. Netanyahu is no longer prime minister, largely because of the allegation that Mandelblit leveled against him and then submitted as an indictment to the court of bribery. And there was no bribe. So that's the first guy he got rid of, Israel's very popular and very successful prime minister. But as you mentioned, this week, just in the past couple of days, we've had 2 of Netanyahu's most loyal and very significant in their own right coalition partners that Mandelblit is leaving office in a month, and he's clearing off his desk. So he's getting rid of Shas leaders, forcing Shas leader Aryeh Deri out of the Knesset in this very strange plea bargain over something that's not even clear. Even Mandelblit himself said no crime was committed, and I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't Deri. And the head of the Ashkenazic ultra-Orthodox party, United Torah Judaism, Litzman, what's his first name? I'm a terrible person. Anyway, Litzman, who is in a way a revolutionary figure in Israeli politics because he's the first ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazic politician, Yaakov Litzman, who served as a minister in an Israeli government. Until Litzman became health minister in Netanyahu's government a few years ago, the Haredim had always refused to serve as ministers because they didn't want ministerial responsibility because on a formal level, they don't recognize Israel. Because they're not Zionists, they're waiting for the Messiah to come before a Jewish kingdom can be rebuilt. So from a theological perspective, something changed under Litzman. So that made him a very significant leader in his own right. And he's resigning at the end of the current Knesset, all because of indictments or legal police investigations that Mandelblit opened against them under with great, hue and cry, right?
Both of the cases are shocking. The case against Litzman is more or less that he adopted terrible policy decisions in 2 different cases. And by the way, he did, right? That is, they were very, very dumb policy decisions that he made, including one on the extradition of a school teacher who had sexually harassed and sexually assaulted students in Australia, and Litzman had made the terrible decision to try to slow down the extradition process rather than speed it up. But if making bad policy decisions were a crime, then not only every single politician should be in jail for at some point or another making a bad policy decision, but everybody in the Justice Department should be, and Mandelblit should be, and the state's attorneys should be. Almost anybody in any senior position in government has made a questionable policy move sometime, and if that's a crime, then they all belong in jail. But of course, it's not a crime. It's not a crime to make bad policy moves. Now, the one about dairy is it's not
what was
quite
the
as
second
shocking,
bad?
but
What was the second? What was the second bad decision that Litzman made?
I'm not remembering at the moment. I'm sorry. You can.
That's okay. I couldn't remember his first name. Anyway,
yeah. But you can mock me about this afterwards.
All right.
Dairy, the charges have to do with, I think, a very questionable interpretation of income tax law, where they're claiming that Dairy should have claimed it as his own personal income that was received by his brother. Now, I don't know if it's a plausible theory that he should have reported his income, but I am pretty sure that it's a questionable enough interpretation of the tax law that it's pretty crazy to file criminal charges about it. But the way the system works, it's not simply that Mandelblit brings politicized charges. It's also that it's completely clear that what's going to happen at the end of the day. I mean, do you have any doubt of the ultimate conviction of Netanyahu on something? I don't, and it's not because he's guilty of something. I know he's not. I know that on the basis of the charges that were filed, there is no crime. I also know that when various justices of the Supreme Court are saying that he has to be brought down in order to save Israeli democracy, there is no chance of a fair trial. Ruth Gabizon said as much before she passed away. She was brought in for consulting purposes by Mandelblit. She wrote this, after being a part of an inner forum that heard Mandelblit's version of this. She said that there's no chance he will get a fair trial, and she was absolutely right.
The late Professor Ruth Gabizon was one of Israel's, for a very long time, for over a generation, was considered to be one of Israel's most important and most original thinkers, jurists.
Right, and very, very strongly and proudly self-identified with the left. Also widely recognized on both sides of the aisle for her personal integrity. That is, she called him.
Which is why Aaron Barak said, "Over my dead body, will she be permitted to be a Supreme Court justice?" Right?
That's correct. It's not because her politics were different. She might have actually been to the left ideologically of Barak, but where she stood on the propriety of judges trying to usurp democratic authority, take over policymaking, she opposed that, and she said so. And that is an agenda that Barak absolutely could not have on his court, because he needed an army to go take over the citadels of power, and that's right. What he got. Anyway, Gabizon said there's no chance of a fair trial. Mandelblit fumed at her, but of course he filed the charges, and there is no chance of a fair trial. This is what you're seeing going on in the courtroom in Jerusalem is a farce, and I can't understand how any self-respecting judge could allow this to go on without dismissing the charges. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope my prediction of a bad ruling is wrong, but I don't see any real chance of a fair outcome.
And some people were talking about there's a retrial going on now in a very well-publicized murder trial of a young girl who was murdered from the Golan Heights, who was murdered in a school bathroom about 10 years ago. And the man who was convicted of a murder, for a long time, there were doubts about his conviction, whether he really did it. And over the years of his incarceration, because he was convicted of murdering her, more and more question marks arose about whether or not it was right. And he's now being retried for the crime. And somebody, I probably was on Twitter, but he was noting how in the retrial of this convicted murderer of this young girl, Teyurada, the judges are aggressively and really in a way routinely, that is in a manner that is routine for judges, asking hard questions of prosecutors in the middle of their presentation of the evidence and challenging them at every turn. And he said, and when you compare the way that the justices are aggressively challenging the prosecutors in the retrial of the Tamir Rada murder trial of the convicted murderer, and you compare it with the very quiet, very meek way that the judges are dealing with the prosecution in Netanyahu's trial, it's really striking that the comparison is that the contrast is very striking, because here, you're seeing over and over again, like I said, right now we have Nir Chefetz, Netanyahu's former spokesman, being cross-examined by Netanyahu's defense attorneys, and he's the eighth witness to give testimony, to testify supposedly against Netanyahu as a prosecution witness, and he's just obliterating their cases. He did it when he was under direct questioning from the prosecutors, who he was ostensibly supposed to help, and he's doing it now. And the judges really aren't asking any tough questions of the prosecutors, like, why did you think that this was a good idea to put him on the stand? How is he advancing your case? Or whatever a judge might ask under the circumstances in which the prosecution's case is no longer existing. Basically, they've been torn to shreds. They have another 300 witnesses that they intend to present against Netanyahu. And if this is what their star witnesses are saying, I just perish at the thought of what their weaker ones are going to do, but it is true. And I want to move on to the second half of our conversation, which is about international lawfare against Israel. But I think here, what I was starting to say about 15 minutes ago is that there's a very large number of people in Israel who no longer have faith in the legal system. And it's been growing over a period of decades as the unelected lawyers arrogate more and more executive and legislative powers to themselves without ever receiving legal approval for their actions. They've harmed just about every group, every Zionist group, at least in Israel, whether it's Israeli residents of Judea and Samaria, or people who live in working class neighborhoods in Tel Aviv that are being overrun by illegal aliens from North Africa, from Eritrea and from Sudan.
Not North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa.
So I'm sorry, Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm thinking, I guess because Egypt is right underneath Israel and then Sudan. Anyway, you're right, it's Sub-Saharan. Anyway, I stand corrected. But they're coming in from Sudan and Eritrea, and they're being protected by the left and by the courts, and they're being allowed to stay. Or if, and you move on to the gas exploration that the Supreme Court was expected to, thankfully didn't destroy. But they get into everything, and essentially nobody has any faith either in the Supreme Court, in the prosecution, or in the Attorney General as institutions of the state.
The polls say that the number of Israelis that have confidence, for example, in the state prosecution, is less than 10%.
So the question is,
shocking numbers.
But the problem is that when you look at what they're doing, and you look at the way that they're so open about talking, what Barak said to me in an intimate dinner conversation, 14 years ago, right, or 7 years ago, 14 years ago, is now openly being stated by the likes of Benish and Mazoz. And Mazoz has been legislating first from the Attorney General's office and now from the Supreme Court for 15 years. And he's introduced some policies that have taken major hits to Zionism, to Israel's identity as a Jewish state. In Supreme Court decision and in his decisions as the Attorney General, he's harmed Israel's rights to build communities for Jewish people in Israel. He's harmed, just so many things. And there's no end in sight. It just seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse. And so I guess my question or my rumination is, it's hard to see how any of this gets remedied.
Look, I'm with Gavi's on this. I don't really care whether Mazoza's policies or Mandelblit's policies are better or worse. I don't want them making them at all. I like democracy. I think that democracy is an asset, and it's one that Israel ought to protect. And unfortunately, I agree with you that Israel has, over the years, the decades of these unelected lawyers taking for themselves powers, Israel has gradually moved away from a Western democracy to something that poli-sci people call tutelary democracy or guardian democracy. You know, it's what
Plato's guardians.
Yeah, what Turkey used to be before Erdogan, where there was democracy within limits, but the army would come in and take over if it didn't like the way things were going. And that's more or less what we have in Israel, where you have democracy within certain limits, but the unelected lawyers don't like the way things are going. They brush people aside. They don't engage in armed coups. They just throw people into jail or shove them out of office. And they make sure that ultimately on the big things, their policies are implemented, and they've won already, right? That is, Israel is today, they don't call it a guardian democracy. The unelected lawyers call themselves gatekeepers, right?
Well, it's substantive democracy is what it is.
Right. They're gatekeepers to the substantive democracy. They're gatekeepers to power, right? That is, they'll allow the masses, the people, sometimes to make decisions, but the person who has to decide, the gatekeeper who decides whether they get in or not, the people at the bouncers at the door, the selectors at the club's doors, that's the unelected lawyers, and they'll decide if you get to go in or you don't get to go in. And I think that this hysteria from Mandelblit and Benish and Mazoz about the alleged danger to democracy from Netanyahu is about this. They understand that having won this victory, having turned Israel from a Western democracy into a tutelary democracy, there are a lot of unhappy people out there, and there is a danger to them. I think it's the ray of light at the end of the tunnel that maybe the people will have their elected representatives take back power and restore Israeli democracy. And this frightens them. That's the danger they see to their rule. And so they call this anti-democratic. They're the anti-democrats. And
well, they are democracy. I mean, the concept in their heads of substantive democracy, which is what they call it, is that they get to make all the decisions. So if they are democracy, then anybody that challenges them is by definition anti-democratic. I mean, and that's what they've done, is that they've remade language. And it's a terrible thing. And the problem is that, it would be really useful to have government lawyers who were interested in defending the country as opposed to ruling it, because Israel is under assault by political enemies that are posing as legal forms, right? And we had a sort of a new pinnacle in this lawfare war against Israel this week. I think it was on Thursday. It was last Thursday. It says here, I'm just looking at the news story, a majority of 125 countries in the UN General Assembly backed on Thursday an unprecedented open-ended war crimes probe against Israel. The probe was initially approved in May by the UN Human Rights Council, which, by the way, just put Iran on their Committee for the Protection of Women or something like that. Anyway, the probe was initially approved in May by the UN Human Rights Council in the aftermath of the Israeli aggression on Gaza that took place in May 2021. The UN General Assembly vote came after Israel asked to amend the UN Human Rights Council budget resolution so that the money for the probe would be excluded from the overall Human Rights Council budget. Only 8 countries voted against the resolution, including the U.S. and Israel, while 34 countries abstained. So there's an open, which means forever. So it'll be going on when our children, children, and our children's children are in charge. You know, it's going to go on.
It's forever. An ongoing star chamber, right? Yes, it's got only one set of defendants. The set of defendants are Israeli Jews. Mm-hmm. It'll go on forever, and it has, frankly, nothing to do with law, which is why I don't think that it's right to say we need government lawyers who are going to defend Israel against this sort of thing, because it's not a legal challenge.
No, but actually that would be a great thing for somebody like the Attorney General of the State of Israel to say. But he doesn't say that, right? I mean, he says, "Oh well."
I don't agree. I think that this is the Attorney General, by the way, does issue his opinions on this, and sometimes I agree with them, and sometimes I don't. But I can tell you, it's none of his business. That is, it's not up to the Attorney General to decide how to deal with foreign policy threats, right? There's an elected government for that.
But here, let me just break it down for a second before we reach the conclusion that this isn't his business. Here they are. They're saying that there's a law, and a law is about something called a war crime, and they're saying that everything that Israel does is a war crime. What, you know, any step that Israel takes to defend itself is a war crime against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against the PLO, against whoever, against Iran. And so they're saying this is law. We're saying that the law says that there's something called a war crime, and there's something called a Jewish war crime, right? And so war crimes are just sort of this thing that we do for hapless Africans, and everything else is something that we applied to Israeli Jews. And the question is, why this isn't the law? There's no law here. What are you talking about?
What we're talking about here is international law. We're not talking about real law. International law is not like any laws that you think about or are familiar with. They're, for the most part, they're not written down. They have no enforcement. They have no courts. Again, for the most part, right? For the most part, not written down, no enforcement, no courts, no final meaning about anything. It's all really ambiguous. And really amorphous. And the reason people like to charge Israel with violating international law is because saying anything definitive about international law is like nailing Jell-O to the wall, right? You get up to the task.
And you're a professor of international law.
That's right.
Right.
Yes. Now, it's not that there's zero substance, but it's pretty close to that. That is, almost anything that you can say, I can say the opposite. And that's what makes it perfect for political rhetoric. Now, I think that treating these charges as if they're legal charges and treating the inquiries as if they are legal inquiries is making a mistake. It's not, it's giving credit to something that doesn't deserve credit. And I'll add something else. You know, the international law is constantly in flux. And one of the reasons is that international law is the things that states agree to do. And states are constantly changing what they agree to do. There's this, the important part of international law, it's called customary law. And it's the things that states do out of the belief that the law requires it. So, if Israel wants to change the law, one of the most important things it should do is act differently and say things that are different, right? Now,
what does that mean? What do you mean? What do you mean?
Let's take something like reprisals, armed reprisals. Are armed reprisals lawful under the laws of war? So traditionally they were, and then a lot of people started saying that they weren't, but Britain still says that they are, and the United States still says that they are. And the way international law works is that If you have somebody who objects to a custom over time, then they're not bound by that custom. And so Israel's best strategy on all of these things is to just say, no, we don't accept that. We don't accept that's part of the law, right? Why should Israel do that? That's Israel's way of refusing to cooperate with this process of making up new anti-Israel law. And so instead of going and making legal arguments, what Israel should be doing is just saying no.
But you know, the worst thing about it, and one of the things that goes back to Mandelblit, and you're saying, well, you don't care what he says or doesn't say because it's none of his business.
No, I care. I want him to say nothing. I want the person to say no.
Let me just go back for a second, because he wasn't always the Attorney General. He wasn't always the Attorney General. Before he was the Attorney General, he was a cabinet secretary. Before he was a cabinet secretary, he was the military advocate general of the IDF. And from that position, he introduced this concept of international law and proportional use of force down to the battalion level, where he was bringing in legal advisors to tell battalion commanders what they could shoot at and what they couldn't shoot at, and what was legal and what wasn't legal, under a very radical interpretation of the limitations on the use of force in what you say, you know, international law is, which is trying to nail down a piece of jello.
Right. So let's see. There are three things that are wrong with this. Right?
Okay.
So one of them is that he's usurping authority that doesn't belong to him. Right. That instead of Israel's elected officials deciding what policy should be for the army, you have this unelected bureaucrat making the policies in the name of the law. That's problem number one. Okay. Problem number two, you're saying, is it's bad policy, and I agree. The interpretation that was being used of these broad concepts of distinction and proportionality, I think that the way they were interpreted was bad policy. It's bad for Israel. It's bad for everyone. I just don't think that the way it was interpreted made any sense. But there's a third problem. And the third problem is unique to international law, and it is when Mandelblit does something like that, or whoever the judge advocate general is in the army, when they do something like that, when they say to junior troops, don't do this because that's what international law says, they are speaking in the name of Israel, and they are telling the world that Israel agrees to this interpretation. And by doing so, they're undermining Israel's ability to shape the future of international law in a better direction, right? And so even if they're, it's bad enough that they're making bad policy. It's bad enough that they're making any policy, but don't do it in the name of international law. Don't claim to represent Israel in making international law positions. Though you're making bad positions, you're harming Israel. And it could be done a lot more strategically, primarily by refusing ever to acknowledge these broad interpretations of international law.
And I mean, I would add a fourth one, which is the human cost of these things, right? Because when you're telling the army that it has to engage in often deadly restraint, deadly towards its own troops, deadly towards Israeli civilians, because you don't want to be accused of carrying out a war crime by the International Criminal Court, which again is a political body, right? Then you're harming your own side physically. I mean, you're forcing bad command decisions to be made at a level where lawyers should never have any say to begin with. So
look, it's not simply that it's making bad policy, right, all the way down to bad defense policy. It's pointless. I mean, anybody who thinks that if Israel adopts a stricter interpretation of the law than everyone else, that somehow or another these star chambers will stop, that this lawfare will stop, that there won't be these commissions of inquiry to bring up charges against Israeli Jews forever, is simply delusional. It fails to understand the political dynamics of what is going on.
And I think in a way that is the key, right? That's the key, that it's all based on misinterpretation, whether deliberate or naive, of what's actually going on here, right? It's
misinterpreting the law, misinterpreting the institutions.
It's believing that there's some basic moral foundation to these institutions, that they're trying to do the right thing, that they might just be misinformed, that if you just play ball with them, then they'll understand. And we've had many soldiers killed in battle and killed in terrorist attacks because of the way that, because of this desire to make nice with these star chambers. And so I think it's really quite extraordinary the way that Israel is being poorly represented on all of these fronts by its lawyers, and specifically by Mandelblit. If we want to blame one person,
Well, it's on many of these issues, it's not just Mandelblit. It's other lawyers, some of whom are candidates to replace Mandelblit.
Right, like Sharon Afek, an outgoing, or recently.
I'm thinking of Shendov, but
he's the head of the International Law Department of the Justice Ministry. Is that right? Or
yeah, and is one of the candidates, one of the leading candidates to take the job. But when I lost my train of thought.
No, you were saying that Mandelblit isn't the only person who's doing this, that they're making.
Before I said that, I had some brilliant remarks.
They're requiring Israeli forces to take these defensive postures, and not go out to the enemy and attack them, because lest the ICC.
What I was going to say. And it's this, if somebody makes the accusation that the leaders of the Jewish state and the soldiers of the Jewish state are evil because they love killing children, anybody who thinks that the way to defeat that sort of argument is to show, look how careful we are about children, is somebody who doesn't understand what's going on. Right. It's the kind of person who thinks that when they had these medieval trials about Jews drinking Christian blood, the blood of Christian children for Passover, that the right thing to do would be to argue that Christian blood is not kosher. It has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with what standards you're operating under. It's the very accusation itself is an expression of bigotry. And one doesn't respond to bigotry by trying to convince the bigot rationally to think otherwise. Right. One blunts the power of bigotry. That's how one defeats it. And so by making rational arguments to these star chambers, to these these free floating inquiries into the evil of the Jews, by making rational arguments to them, you're strengthening them. You're failing to point out or failing to address them as the bigots they are, and instead you're treating this as if this is perfectly normal law. This is the regular wheels of justice turning. They're not, and you can't treat it that way. And so. Yeah.
But so you're dealing, it's like I just finished reading an extraordinary book which came out a year ago. Everybody Loves Dead Jews, I think is what it's called, by an author named Dara Horn, who's absolutely fabulous, I have to say. But she talks about how she got roped into listening to a podcast of the Merchant of Venice with her 10-year-old son. And the whole idea that people are these apologists for Shakespeare and trying to come up with this crazy notion that Shylock, who is a repulsive caricature, distorted image of a Jew that was put out in a context of vicious anti-Semitism in Elizabethan England. And she gives a whole context of all the events that occurred around the time that he wrote The Merchant of Venice. the idea that because he says, if I bleed, if you draw blood, I will not bleed, or whatever, the thing is, aren't I a human being too?
Break me, shall I?
Yeah, right, all that. So, that the idea that shows that, Shakespeare really meant to humanize the Jew, is appalling, because he was the villain. He was the cartoon character villain in Batman, and the idea that saying, oh, but you're supposed to have empathy for me is absurd. I mean, it was a completely anti-Semitic play, and Shakespeare wrote it apparently because he was an anti-Semite, as were just about everybody, as was just about everybody in England at that point. But let me just say, so the question is, when you're dealing with these star chambers, you're dealing with this bigotry against Israel, the Jewish state, people said, well, what are we supposed to do? So you said it's not lawyers. So who is it? Is it the foreign ministry that's supposed to deal with it? I mean, our foreign minister, God bless him, thinks that anti-Semitism is indistinguishable from all forms of racism, and there's nothing special about any of them. And our foreign ministry diplomats, they aren't the most.
Okay, I have an answer for you.
What are you saying? What is Israel? Who would be the ones to respond to this from the Israeli government?
I have an answer. I have an answer for you, but first, I just want to say something about the Shakespeare comment. I think that it's in general less important whether the particular person is a bigot than to understand that the actions are an expression of bigotry. Maybe Shakespeare's a really nice guy and didn't believe in the anti-Semitism, or maybe he did. But without any doubt, Shylock is an expression of the anti-Semitism of that society coming through Shakespeare's writing.
Right.
Now, the best you can say for Shakespeare is that maybe he personally, and this is what I gather she's arguing against, but the best thing you can say for him is that he personally was in a small way trying to disagree with the overwhelming anti-Semitism of his society. And the worst you could say of it is, no, he was actually in tune with that. But either way, you get to the same point, which is it's an expression of that bigotry. Now, I think that's important to remember when we look at these star chambers and the rest. I mean, there will be people among them who may be in their own small way not bigots. They're not biased against Jews. They're just giving expression to it. It's the atmosphere around them, the United Nations, and they just carry it on like automatons, right? They're just carrying it through, and they just as much as everyone else are carrying out a bigoted policy, whatever they may personally think. Now, the question of what can we do about it? The question of what we can do about it ultimately is a unified political strategy, right? Now, it's not that lawyers have no place in such a unified political strategy. If you're carrying out a unified political strategy, then part of it will be selective use of legal means to carry out your policy aims. That's what lawfare is. And if they're waging lawfare against you, then you have to wage lawfare against them too. But that also means that you don't walk into the battlefields that they select and use the tools that they select and allow them to shoot at you. Right. If you want to block an inquiry like this, then you go around it. You file legal actions against funding it, for example, right, in friendlier states, right, or political actions against them, and all of it has to be organized on the background of a political strategy. And a political strategy doesn't simply involve legal measures, and not primarily legal measures. It's statecraft, and statecraft involves diplomacy, and it involves lawfare, and it involves elbows, right? That is, there's a little bit of power politics and pushing back that you have to understand here. Now, the United Nations is an institution with some power, but it's not unlimited power. It has all sorts of weaknesses, and it is the enemy here. It is the one that is carrying out this bigoted war against the Jewish people and against the Jewish state. And you need an overall strategy where the lawyers will do what they're told by their commanders, who are the elected leadership of the country.
I think we're gonna have to close soon, but I think I would be remiss a week like this to close when we're talking about this open star chamber that will be going on in perpetuity against the Jews, without mentioning that one of the, I would say the authors, but one of the people who really played a huge role in mainstreaming contemporary Jew hatred that vilifies Israel and everything that it does in its own defense, and Jews who support Israel, died yesterday, and that is Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And I got very irate when I saw on Twitter that Senator Schumer he tweeted a New York Times obituary of Desmond Tutu and talked about what a great champion of human rights he was, without mentioning that he's an anti-Semite. And it sort of reminded me.
Well, he was a great champion of non-Jewish human rights.
Right, but it sort of reminded me of Henry Ford, that Henry Ford was an incredible, he changed the world. His automation changed the world. The Model T changed the world. And he also, he was like a Nazi. He was one of the most prolific and powerful anti-Semites in American history. And he caused massive damage to the Jewish people in the United States and really all around the world, because he was one of the people who was blocking Jewish immigration into the United States in the 1920s as well. So, it's hard as a practical matter to look at Henry Ford when you're a Jew and just feel warm and fuzzy about what he did for assembly lines, for the productive capacity of the world, really, because he was such an enemy of the Jewish people. And in a way, when I was thinking that, I'd like to write an article for Newsweek about, or Israeli, I'm not sure, about Desmond Tutu. And it's really annoying, right? Because you have these people who are ostensibly great men. And Desmond Tutu was a fantastic champion of the anti-apartheid movement. But, last December, he wrote an article in the Guardian. He's already 89 years old. He's dying, right, of prostate surgery. He writes an article in the Guardian, which calls for then President-elect Joe Biden to expose Israel's nuclear, to end U.S. pretense over over Israel's secret nuclear weapons. He said that that for Israel to have a nuclear arsenal was a danger to the entire world because they're an apartheid regime, and he said that Israel was responsible for the Iraq War. And several other blood libels against Israel. And, this is just a year before he died. And he constantly was one of the originators of the boycott movement against Israel and calling Israel an apartheid state, which is a form of political warfare against the Jews. And, I just sort of looking at the way that he's being lionized in his death by all the media, even here in Israel, because of what he did for the fight against apartheid. And
I have a lot of Protestant friends, many of whom admire Martin Luther. And Martin Luther did a lot of things that were very important for Christianity, that changed modern Christianity. And I can understand why someone who is a Protestant, particularly from one of the churches that were influenced by Martin Luther, would not see Luther primarily as what he was, which was a vicious, horrible anti-Semite. That said, I don't understand how you can talk about Luther without describing, or at least acknowledging, this great moral flaw of his, which was that he was a bigot, that he was an anti-Semite, that he wrote encouraged some terrible things, which arguably led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands or millions of Jews. Now, I can understand if you believe that Desmond Tutu was extremely instrumental in the fall of apartheid in South Africa, that is your main focus, and that you laud Tutu for his role in bringing down apartheid. But I can't understand how you can be silent about this other blindingly obvious moral flaw of his, which was that he was a vicious anti-Semite, that he hated Jews, and that he devoted an enormous amount of his time to promoting that bigotry and trying to do ill to the world's Jews. I just don't understand how you can be silent about that.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the problems with Jew hatred that we're seeing today, and we're seeing it in Lawfare at the UN and at so many other international forums today, and we're seeing it in the progressive left in the United States, and I dare say even in Israel, where there are only certain types of anti-Semites that you're supposed to be able to see, and there are others that you make excuses for, and so you could write full volumes about white supremacy and anti-Semitism from Charlottesville to the Tree of Life Synagogue to San Diego. But all of the reportage on the Black anti-Semites who massacred Jews in Jersey City and in Muncie just, a year and a half ago or 2 years ago in December 2019, the reporting starts with the excuses and blaming the victims for it in a way that no other victim group would ever be blamed for their own massacre by the American media. And so, I mean, I think there's a lot of that going around. And Desmond Tutu exploiting his record as an anti-apartheid champion of the anti-apartheid movement to advance the cause of and the popularization and the mainstreaming of Jew hatred in the world. I think is somebody who I don't mourn. Simple as that. Don't mourn him. Don't mourn him. And on that happy note, I'm not wearing red, but if I were, that would be that. But I'm wearing burgundy. But anyway, all right. Well, guys, I wanted you to hear what Professor Avi Bell, Professor Avi Bell, my very good friend, thinks, because I think his is one of the most important legal minds in Israel, and I dare say in the Jewish world today, both on issues of Israeli law and law in Israel and lawfare inside of Israel by Israel's legal fraternity, and also the international legal or use of the language of law to try to demonize and delegitimize the Jewish state. So Avi, thank you very much for joining me and my viewers and listeners today. And you can come back anytime that I have time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was a great pleasure.
All right, thanks. Well, and we will definitely have Avi back as his time allows, and as the issues relate to all the very important things that he does for Israel and for humanity as a whole. All right, take care, guys. We will see you next week for another edition of the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour. And remember to subscribe and share and spread the word that everybody should be watching the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour. Take care. Have a great week.